Those jars of useless seeds in your cellar. That's what my son said when he sold our family legacy to pay a $200,000 hospital bill I'd never seen. At 78, barely recovered from pneumonia that nearly killed me, I listened in stunned silence as my son and daughter-in-law plotted to liquidate my worthless hobby. They thought I was just a sick, powerless old man. They were wrong. Instead of anger or pleading, I laughed. A cold laugh like winter morning frost. I hung up and drove straight to Omaha. Those useless seeds, they were worth $150 million, and the best part, my daughter-in-law knew exactly that from the very beginning. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The prairie wind rattled the old window pane, a familiar sound that had been the soundtrack to my 78 years. It was a different sound from inside the house, a low moan rather than the sharp hiss it made out in the open fields. For 3 weeks in the hospital I'd heard only the sterile beep of machines and the hushed, rubber-soled footsteps of nurses. Now, back in my own home, the house itself seemed to be breathing around me, settling its old bones just as I was settling mine. My breath still caught in my chest if I moved too quickly, a ghost of the pneumonia that had wrapped its icy hands around my lungs. The doctors called it a miraculous recovery. I called it stubbornness. I took a slow sip of the weak tea Brenda had left for me. It tasted like warm water, my sense of taste still dulled by the medication. Everything felt muted, distant. I sat in the worn leather of my father's armchair, its surface cracked and mapped like the dry Nebraska soil in late August. My hands resting on the armrests looked alien to me. The skin was thinner, the veins more pronounced, a roadmap of a life spent working the land. But now they felt weak, trembling with a faint tremor I couldn't control. I looked out the window past the porch to the horizon where the vast, empty sky met the endless sea of dormant cornfields. This land had demanded everything from my grandfather, my father, and me. It demanded strength, patience, and an understanding that some things of value grow not in seasons but over generations. The shrill digital cry of the telephone cut through the quiet. It was an unwelcome sound, a piece of the city intruding on the calm of the plains. I let it ring 3 times before reaching for it, my movements deliberate and slow. It was Marcus. It was always Marcus on a Tuesday. "Dad, you there?" His voice was sanitized, efficient, the sound of a man who spent his days in meetings under fluorescent lights. "I'm here, son," I said. My own voice was gravelly, a stranger in my own throat. "Just a quick call. How are you feeling?" Brenda said the nurse was happy with your progress. The questions were routine, a checklist to be completed. "I'm breathing. That's progress enough." My thumb traced the worn grain of the wooden table beside me. He didn't ask what it felt like to have your own lungs betray you. He asked about the nurse's report. Good, good. "That's great," he said a little too quickly. "Listen, I actually have some good news. Something to take a bit of the financial pressure off, with all those medical bills." I stayed silent, letting the empty space hang between Nebraska and his office in Omaha. I knew exactly what my Medicare and supplemental insurance covered. The pressure he was talking about wasn't mine. "Those jars of useless seeds in your cellar," he continued, his voice brightening. "Brenda found a buyer, a collector or something. It's all taken care of. That little hobby of yours just paid for her new wellness retreat business." A long silence stretched across the phone line. The wind moaned against the house. I looked at my hands, the faint tremor suddenly gone. Then a sound rumbled up from deep within my chest, a sound I hadn't made in weeks. I laughed. It wasn't a sound of joy or relief. It was a low, earthy thing like the sound of old dry ground breaking open. Marcus was confused. "Dad, what's so funny?" "Oh, Marcus," I said, my voice steady, clear, and cold as a winter morning. "If you only knew what you just sold. And more importantly, if you only knew what you just bought for yourself." I placed the receiver back on its cradle with a deliberate click. The tremor in my hands was gone. The fog of weakness that had clouded my mind for weeks had burned away, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. The pneumonia had taken my strength, but my son's foolishness had given it back. I pushed myself up from the armchair, my muscles protesting but obeying. There was no question of what came next. Some things cannot be handled over a telephone line. The drive to Omaha was a straight shot east on the interstate, an hour of watching the flat brown landscape of late autumn roll by. This land wasn't beautiful in the way of mountains or oceans, but it was honest. It told a story of hard work, of drought and flood, of seasons of bounty and seasons of loss. It was a story my son had never learned to read. He saw assets and liabilities, square footage and property taxes. He didn't see the legacy written in the soil. He didn't understand that what we kept in that cellar wasn't a hobby. It was the final chapter of a book, written by 4 generations of Hayes men. Marcus lived in one of those new suburban developments, where every house was a slight variation of the one next to it all, painted in muted shades of beige and gray. His lawn was perfectly manicured, a sterile green carpet that looked like it had never been walked on. I parked my dusty Ford pickup, a relic from another world, in his clean, empty driveway and walked to the front door. He opened it before I could knock, his face pale, his eyes shifting nervously. "Dad, I didn't expect you to drive all this way." "We need to talk, Marcus," I said, stepping past him into the entryway. The air inside smelled of cinnamon-scented air freshener, a chemical sweetness that tried and failed to smell like home. The walls were bare except for a few pieces of generic art. It was a house, not a home, a place where people lived but not where lives were built. "Can I get you something, water, your tea?" he stammered. "Coffee. Black," I said, walking into his kitchen. It was a showroom kitchen, all stainless steel and gleaming granite countertops. Not a crumb was out of place. I sat at the island, my worn denim jacket feeling out of place against the sleek, modern stool. I watched him fumble with the expensive coffee machine, his hands shaking slightly. He was a 46-year-old man, a director at a major company, and he looked like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. He placed the mug in front of me and stood on the other side of the island, a barrier of polished stone between us. "Dad, about the phone call," he began. I held up a hand, silencing him. I took a slow sip of the coffee. It was bitter strong. "Good. I don't want your excuses, Marcus. I don't want Brenda's version of the story filtered through you. I want the truth." I leaned forward, my voice low and even. "I want you to tell me everything, from the very beginning, from the moment Brenda first mentioned those useless seeds. And I want you to do it while looking me in the eye." Marcus avoided my gaze, his eyes fixed on a meaningless spot on the granite countertop. He took a shaky breath, the sound loud in the quiet kitchen. "It started when you were in the ICU," he began, his voice low, choked with a shame he was only just beginning to understand. "The doctors, they weren't sure you were going to make it. Brenda was a wreck. She was at the hospital day and night." I remained silent, letting him talk. I knew for a fact that Brenda had visited me exactly twice, for no more than 15 minutes each time. "Then the hospital's finance office called," he continued, gaining a little momentum as he recited the rehearsed story. "They said there were complications, procedures that weren't fully covered by your insurance. They called them extraordinary measures." "Extraordinary measures," I repeated. The words tasted like ash. "Yes, and your Medicare wouldn't touch it. Brenda said they claimed it was experimental. The out-of-pocket costs were astronomical. They were talking about putting a lien on the farm if we couldn't pay." He finally looked at me, his eyes pleading, searching for an ounce of understanding. "Dad, we were looking at over $200,000. We didn't have it. I didn't know what to do. And Brenda found a solution I stated, not asked." "Yes," he said, relief washing over his face, grateful for the prompt. "She was amazing. She spent hours on the phone calling contacts, trying to figure something out. She was the one who found the buyer for the collection. She said it was a private enthusiast who had heard about your work years ago. He was willing to pay cash right away." It seemed like a miracle. "A miracle," I echoed, my voice flat. The only sound in the kitchen was the low hum of the stainless steel refrigerator. "She said we had to act fast. The buyer was on a deadline. If we didn't sell, then the offer would be gone, and the hospital would start seizing assets." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a boy. "I thought I was protecting you, Dad. I thought I was protecting the farm, your legacy. I signed the papers. I thought I was doing the right thing." He finished, his shoulders slumping, the story finally told. He had laid out the elaborate tapestry of lies Brenda had woven for him, and he expected me to see the picture of a desperate, loving wife. But all I saw were the loose threads. I let the silence sit between us for a long moment, letting the weight of his words settle in the sterile air. "She showed you these hospital bills?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "Yes, stacks of them. Invoices, projections. It all looked official. And you never once thought to call my insurance broker, to ask a single question. You were unconscious, Dad. And then Brenda said you couldn't be stressed, that the news might give you a relapse." He was getting defensive now, the shame curdling into anger. What was I supposed to do? I leaned back slightly, my gaze never leaving his. "She told you the medical bills were that high?" I asked again, letting the question hang in the air. "Interesting, because my Medicare statements tell a very different story. And they're in the glove box of my truck right now." The color drained from Marcus's face. He gripped the edge of the granite counter, his knuckles turning white. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That can't be right. I saw the bills, Dad. Brenda showed them to me. They were from the hospital." "I'm sure they were," I said calmly. "It's not hard to print a letterhead. It is, however, very hard to fake a federal document. Stay here." I turned and walked out of the kitchen, my footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floors. I didn't look back, but I could feel his terrified gaze on me. The front door opened with a soft click, and the crisp Nebraska air hit my face. It felt clean, real. I walked to my old truck, the familiar squeak of the driver's side door, a comforting sound. From the glove box, I pulled out a thick manila envelope, sealed and pristine. It contained every piece of paper related to my hospital stay. When I walked back into the kitchen, Marcus hadn't moved. He looked like a statue carved from fear. I didn't say a word. I simply opened the envelope and laid the documents out on the island between us. Black and white, official and utterly merciless. "This one," I said, tapping a page with my finger, "is the explanation of benefits from Medicare. It details every procedure, every medication, every single day I was in their care. And this column right here shows what they paid. And this one," I slid another paper forward, "is from my supplemental insurance. It shows what they paid." I let him absorb the numbers. I watched his eyes scan the lines, his mind trying to reconcile this reality with the fiction he had been fed. "And this last page," I said, my voice dropping to just above a whisper, "is the final bill from the hospital. The real one, the one they sent to me." I pointed to the bottom line, a single damning number. "Total patient responsibility." "Read it out loud, Marcus." He stared at the number, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. "Read it," I commanded, my voice still quiet but with an edge of steel he hadn't heard since he was a teenager. 500, he finally choked out the word barely audible. "And $42. $542. I repeated, letting the number hang in the air. A stark contrast to the $250,000 of his story. Not 200,000, not even 1,000. "That was the cost of your panic, son. The price of your trust." He collapsed onto the stool opposite me, his head in his hands. A dry, ragged sob escaped his throat. It wasn't the sound of sadness, but of utter, hollowed-out devastation. The entire foundation of his decision, the moral justification he had clung to, had just been pulverized into dust before his eyes. "She lied," he whispered into his hands. "She lied to me. About everything." I took a slow sip of my now cold coffee. "Yes, she did," I said. "She lied to give you a reason, son. But the lie about the cost isn't the most important part of this. The most important part is what she needed a reason for. The lie about the hospital bills was small. The lie about the value of what you sold. That's the one that's going to break you." "She lied, Marcus," repeated his voice muffled by his hands. "She lied about all of it." "Yes," I said, my voice devoid of pity. "But the lie about the hospital bills was just the bait, son. It was the excuse to get you to sign the papers. The real crime, the real betrayal, was what was on those papers." He lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen. "What are you talking about? Their value? It was a collection of old seeds in jars. A hobby. You never made a dime from it. You measure value in dimes, Marcus. I measure it in generations." I leaned forward, my hands flat on the cold granite. "That hobby started with your great-grandfather after the Dust Bowl. He watched his crops wither and die, watched his neighbors pack up and leave. So he started searching for seeds that could survive. Seeds that remembered what it was like to go without water, seeds that knew how to fight off the blight without poison." I paused, letting the history sink in. This wasn't a story I'd ever told him in full. He'd never shown an interest. "Your grandfather continued the work, and I perfected it. What was in that cellar wasn't a collection, Marcus. It was an archive. The Prairie Legacy Archive. Over 200 varieties of heirloom corn and wheat, each one a genetic fortress of resilience. Drought-resistant, pest-resistant, capable of growing in soil other crops would die in." He was staring at me now, a flicker of dawning horror in his eyes. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know. You never asked." The words were sharper than I intended. "You were too busy climbing the corporate ladder in Omaha to care about what was happening in the dirt back home. But other people knew. Very powerful people." "What people?" he whispered. "Have you ever heard of a company called AgriCorp?" He nodded slowly. "Of course. They're one of the biggest agricultural biotech companies in the world. They're also the company that's been trying to buy my hobby for the last 10 years. They know exactly what's in those jars." They know that the genetic code for the future of farming isn't in their sterile laboratories. It's in our cellar. They want to patent those genes, Marcus. Own them. Sell them back to farmers for a fortune. He swallowed hard. They made you an offer, several, I said, all of which I refused. This archive isn't for sale. It's a legacy. It belongs to the land. How much? He pressed, his voice trembling. How much did they offer? I looked him straight in the eye, holding his gaze. You sold them for $200,000, Marcus. I let my own words hang in the air for a beat. The initial offer from AgriCorp, the one I turned down 5 years ago, was $10 million. The sound that escaped his lips was a strangled gasp. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a sickly grayish color. He looked like he was going to be sick, right there on his polished floor. 10 million. That was their starting bid, I said, leaning in closer, my voice dropping even lower. And even they didn't know the real secret hidden in those seeds. More Marcus stammered, his face a mask of disbelief. How could it possibly be worth more than $10 million? It's just seeds, Dad. No matter how special, it's just seeds. To you, maybe, I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a surgeon's scalpel. To AgriCorp, it was a research and development gold mine, a shortcut worth millions. But even they were just guessing at the potential. They didn't know about the agreement I made 2 years ago. Agreement? What agreement? You never told me about any agreement. I told you everything you needed to know, I corrected him gently, which at the time was nothing. You showed no interest, so I handled my own affairs. 2 years ago, I was approached by a consortium of independent organic farmers and a university research program. They didn't want to buy the archive. They wanted to partner with it. I let him process that. The concept of partnership was alien in his world of acquisitions and liquidations. We signed a quiet research agreement, I continued. They've been studying one specific strain of corn from the archive, variety 72, your great-grandmother's prize strain, a corn that requires 30% less water than standard hybrids and is completely immune to the corn borer beetle. Marcus was just staring his mind, clearly struggling to keep up. 6 months ago, they had a breakthrough. They isolated the gene responsible. That breakthrough triggered a clause in our agreement, a licensing deal. For the next 20 years, any seed developed using that gene will pay a royalty back to the Prairie Legacy Archive Trust. A royalty, he repeated mechanically. Yes, a small percentage of a very, very large number. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on his. I had held this information back, waiting for this exact moment, the moment of absolute clarity. Last month, they signed their first major distribution deal based on that technology. The projected revenue over the life of the contract for our trust alone is estimated at over $150 million. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so complete I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator again, the ticking of a clock in the other room. The sleek, modern kitchen felt like a vacuum, all the air sucked out of it. Marcus didn't collapse this time. He just sat there, frozen, his face completely devoid of color or expression. He looked like a man who had just watched the world end. $150 million. He finally breathed the words like foreign sounds. Conservatively, I added, twisting the knife. And here is the most important part of the story, son. The part you need to understand. I paused, making sure I had his complete, undivided attention. AgriCorp didn't know about that deal. It was a private agreement. But someone else did. Who think Marcus? Who had access to my office? Who was always asking polite, innocent questions about my work, who has a background in commercial real estate where knowing the hidden value of an asset is everything. I didn't need to say her name. The realization dawned on his face like a slow, sickening sunrise. Brenda, he whispered. Brenda knew. Brenda knew, Marcus whispered again, the words hollow, lifeless. He looked up at me, his face a ruin. All this time, our whole marriage. Was it all about this? I can't answer that, son, I said, my voice softer now. The time for brutal truths was over. Now was the time for cold facts. But I can tell you that my suspicion started a long time before you two were even engaged. His head snapped up. What? Why didn't you say anything, and what would I have said? I countered. That your fiancée was a little too polished. That her questions about the farm's finances were a little too sharp for someone who claimed to have no interest in agriculture. You were in love, Marcus. You wouldn't have listened. A father's intuition isn't evidence. I stood up from the stool and walked to the window, looking out at his perfectly manicured lawn. But it is a reason to be cautious. A reason to protect what's yours. "So what did you do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I made a phone call," I said, turning back to face him. "To an old friend, the daughter of a man I grew up with, and the sharpest mind in agricultural law in this state. Her name is Eleanor Schmidt." I let the name settle in the room. I didn't ask her to investigate Brenda, not at first. I asked her to help me protect the archive, to bulletproof it legally, to make sure that no one, not a corporation, not a greedy in-law, not even my own naive son, could ever give it away. Marcus flinched as if I'd slapped him. And Brenda Eleanor is thorough. When she started digging into the trust paperwork, she started seeing things that didn't add up. Brenda's financial history was a mess of debt and shell companies. It didn't match the successful real estate broker image she projected. So, with my permission, Eleanor hired a private investigator. I walked back to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside. The cool air was a relief. I went to my truck, opened the passenger door, and pulled out a thick 2-inch binder from under the seat. It was heavy solid. It was the weight of 6 months of secrets. I walked back into the kitchen and placed the binder on the granite island, with a solid, definitive thud. The sound echoed in the silent room. Marcus stared at it, as if it were a venomous snake. "What is that?" "This," I said, tapping the cover, "is the truth. Every lie she's ever told. Every debt she's hidden. Every phone call she's made to a certain vice president at Agricorp. It's all in here." I looked at him, my gaze unwavering. "This was never just about you being foolish, son. This was a corporate espionage operation from day one, and your wife was their inside woman." I pushed the binder across the island towards him. "And now, I think it's time you met my attorney." Marcus didn't touch the binder. He stared at it like it was a coffin, his own naive beliefs buried inside. His breathing was shallow, ragged. For a full minute, the only sound was the relentless ticking of the clock on his minimalist wall. You investigated my wife." He finally managed, his voice cracking. "No, son," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "I investigated the woman who married my son. There's a difference. I had to know who I was entrusting my legacy to." I nudged the binder an inch closer to him. "Go on, open it. The truth won't bite, but it will burn." With a trembling hand, he reached out and opened the cover. The first page was a simple summary sheet, a financial overview compiled by Eleanor's investigator. Columns of numbers, credit scores, and account balances. He didn't need to read the details. He just stared at the final line. Estimated undisclosed debt, $380. 000. This is impossible," he whispered. "Her business is successful. She just landed a huge commercial contract. Did you ever see the paperwork for that contract, Marcus? Or did you just take her word for it?" I asked gently. "Flip the page." He did. The next section was bank statements. 3 different accounts at 3 different out-of-state banks, none of which he had ever heard of. He scanned the pages, his eyes widening at the pattern of deposits and immediate frantic withdrawals. "What is all this?" "That is the paper trail of a woman living far beyond her means. That's the money from loans she took out using falsified income statements. And this," I said, flipping forward another 20 pages, "is my personal favorite. The phone records." He stared at the logs. Calls made from Brenda's cell phone listed by date and time. And one number repeated over and over again for the past 6 months, often just minutes after she'd spoken with him. "Who is that?" Marcus asked. "That's the direct line to the office of Walter Jennings, Vice President of Acquisitions at Agricorp." The name landed on the granite countertop with the force of a hammer blow. Marcus physically recoiled, pushing the stool back with a screech. "Number, yes, son. Every step of the way. While she was telling you how much she loved you, she was reporting her progress back to her real partner." He looked utterly broken, a man hollowed out from the inside. He looked up at me, the last shred of denial gone from his eyes, replaced by a desperate pleading question he didn't know how to ask. I knew what he needed. He needed someone to tell him what to do next. I pulled out my old flip phone, a device Brenda always made fun of. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It was answered on the first ring. "Eleanor," I said. "It's Gideon. He knows." There was a pause on the other end, a moment of shared understanding between old friends. "Is he ready?" Her voice came back calm and steady as a rock. "Yes," I said, looking at my shattered son. "He's ready. Come on over." Just as I hung up the phone, we both heard it. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I didn't need to get the door. A moment later, it opened and Eleanor Schmidt stepped inside. She was 72, with a sharp, intelligent face framed by a neat helmet of silver hair. She moved with a purpose that defied her age, her eyes taking in the entire scene in a single sweeping glance. the gleaming kitchen, the binder on the counter, and my broken son sitting before it. She gave me a brief, firm nod. "Gideon," she said, her voice like slate cool and hard. She then turned her full attention to Marcus. She walked over and extended a hand. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Eleanor Schmidt. I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances." Marcus, dazed, managed to stand and shake her hand. It was a firm, no-nonsense grip. I don't understand what's happening," he stammered. "That's why I'm here," Eleanor said, pulling out the stool next to him and sitting down, as if she owned the place. She placed a thin leather briefcase on the counter. "Your father is a far better strategist than you seem to give him credit for. He saw this storm coming a long way off." "You knew?" Marcus asked, looking at me with a fresh wave of disbelief. "You knew this was going to happen. I knew there was a threat," I clarified. "I didn't know what form it would take. That's why I hired the best. Eleanor, would you care to explain what we did?" Eleanor opened her briefcase. She didn't pull out any papers. She just folded her hands on top of it. "Marcus," she began, her tone direct and clear, "what you need to understand is that the Prairie Legacy Archive stopped being just a collection of seeds in a legal sense over a year ago. After your father voiced his concerns to me, we took steps to protect it." "What steps?" Marcus asked. "We restructured its ownership. The archive was legally designated as a sovereign genetic resource and placed into an irrevocable family trust. Think of it like a national park or a protected landmark. It has a special legal status." I watched my son's face. He was a businessman. He understood trusts and legal structures. I could see the wheels turning in his head. "The terms of that trust are very specific," Eleanor continued. "Any transfer of assets, any sale, any licensing agreement requires the unanimous notarized consent of 2 trustees. "Who are the trustees?" Marcus whispered, though I think he already knew the answer. Eleanor gestured to me, then to herself. "Your father and me. The sale Brenda orchestrated, the papers you signed. They were legally meaningless. She might as well have sold him the Brooklyn Bridge." Marcus stared at us, his mind reeling. So the sale isn't valid. It can be reversed." Reversed? Eleanor allowed a small, grim smile to touch her lips. "Oh, it's much better than that. We didn't just build a fence to keep thieves out, Marcus. We built a trap. And your wife, along with her partners at AgriCorp, just walked right into the middle of it." "A trap?" Marcus echoed, his voice thin. "What do you mean a trap? If the sale was illegal, why did you let it happen?" Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. "Because stopping a crime is one thing. Documenting it, letting the criminals expose themselves, and then holding them accountable for it on a federal level, that's justice. And that's what your father wanted." I gave a slow nod. She understood perfectly. This was never just about getting the seeds back. "When we set up the trust," Eleanor explained, "we knew Brenda would eventually make a move. The private investigator's report showed she was deeply in debt and in contact with AgriCorp. It was only a matter of time. Your father's illness just gave her the opportunity she was waiting for." "So you knew she would try to sell it?" Marcus asked, horrified. "We knew it was a strong possibility," Eleanor corrected. "So we prepared. We could have sent a cease and desist letter. We could have warned you. But what would that have accomplished? Brenda would have denied everything, played the victim. AgriCorp would have backed away, and they would have simply waited for another chance. We would have won a battle, but the war would have continued." She paused, letting him absorb the strategic thinking. Instead, we decided to let her play her hand. We let her create a fraudulent paper trail. We let her use a compromised notary. We let her convince you to sign documents that had no legal weight. "Why?" Marcus pleaded. "Why let me do that to my own father?" "Because your signature isn't the important one, Marcus," I said, speaking for the first time since Eleanor had started. "It was her actions that mattered. It was her conspiracy." Eleanor picked up the thread seamlessly. "Exactly. The moment she transferred those funds from the buyer into her personal accounts, this stopped being a simple case of contract fraud. Because of the archive's special designation as a sovereign genetic resource, she didn't just sell a piece of property. She trafficked in protected genetic material. That elevated the crime from a state matter to a federal one. She let that sink in. Brenda thinks she's just committed a clever real estate scam. She has no idea she's violated the Federal Biopiracy Act. It's a rarely prosecuted law, but it carries a penalty of up to 20 years in prison and millions of dollars in fines." The air in the kitchen grew cold. Marcus stared at Eleanor, then at me, then back again. He looked like a man trying to read a language he'd never seen before. And AgriCorp Eleanor continued, her voice hardening, by knowingly funding and facilitating this transaction, made themselves co-conspirators in a federal crime. So, what happens now? Marcus whispered. Eleanor's grim smile returned. Now the trap is sprung. According to my sources, Brenda is getting nervous. The money has been wired, but AgriCorp hasn't been able to access the physical archive or the genetic data. They're pressuring her, and she's starting to panic. She looked at Marcus, her eyes pinning him in place. She's about to call you, Marcus. She's going to need her gullible husband to help fix things. But you're not going to answer. We're going to call her. Call her, Marcus's voice was a panicked squeak. But what do I say? What am I supposed to do? She'll know something's wrong. Of course she will, Eleanor said flatly. She's a cornered animal, and she's expecting trouble. That's why you are not going to give it to her. You are not going to be angry. You are not going to accuse her. You are going to be the same trusting, slightly overwhelmed husband she's been playing for the last 2 years. I watched my son. He looked like a man being asked to walk a tightrope over a canyon. I can't, he said, shaking his head. I can't pretend. Not after. After all this. He gestured vaguely at the binder at the kitchen, at his entire shattered life. You have to, I said, my voice firm but quiet. This is not about pretending, Marcus. This is about taking the first step to fix what you helped break. You let her abuse your trust to start this mess. Now we are going to use that same trust to end it. Eleanor nodded in agreement. Your father is right. Your role here is critical. We have the paper trail to prove fraud. But what we need from this call is a direct verbal confirmation of her intent and her connection to AgriCorp. We need to get her to admit, in her own words, that this was a premeditated plan. How do I do that? He asked, his voice desperate. You play confused, Eleanor instructed, her tone like a director coaching an actor. You tell her your father is back, and he's talking about lawyers and trusts and things you don't understand. You tell her the hospital bills don't match. You ask her questions. Simple, naive questions. Let her be the smart one. Let her explain her own lies. The more she talks, the deeper a hole she digs for herself. But she'll be suspicious, Marcus insisted. She'll know I'm setting her up. No, I interjected. She won't, because a guilty person's arrogance is their greatest weakness. She thinks you're a fool, Marcus. She's counting on it. All you have to do is not disappoint her. He looked from me to Eleanor, the weight of the task pressing down on him. I could see the war in his eyes, the fear of failure against the burning need for redemption. For a long moment he said nothing. He just sat there, breathing heavily. Finally he closed his eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and opened them again. The panic was still there, but underneath it something new had taken root. Resolve. Okay, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Okay, what do I say first? Eleanor didn't smile, but her eyes showed a flicker of approval. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small black digital recorder and a single earpiece. You don't say anything first, she said, sliding the device across the granite counter. You answer the phone. I'll be listening to every word, and I'll be right here if you get lost. But I don't think you will. Eleanor worked with a quiet efficiency that was both calming and terrifying. She attached the small recorder to Marcus's cell phone and handed him the single earpiece, which he fitted clumsily. The small black box looked like a weapon on the sterile granite. She nodded at me, then at Marcus. Remember, she murmured, you're just a confused husband worried about his father. Let her lead, now. I watched my son's finger hover over the screen, his hand trembling so much he had to steady it with his other. He took one last ragged breath and pressed the call button. He put the phone on speaker, the volume low enough so only we could hear it clearly. The silence in the kitchen was broken by the artificial sound of a phone ringing. Once, twice. Each ring felt like a hammer blow against my own ribs. Then her voice filled the room, bright and sharp. Marcus, finally. I've been trying to reach you for hours. Is everything okay? Marcus swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. Brenda, he said, and I was proud of the slight tremor he managed to put in his voice. Honey, something's happened. Happened? What's happened? Are you okay? There was a note of impatience in her concern. It's Dad, Marcus said, following Eleanor's script perfectly. He's back. He came home from the hospital. He's home. That's wonderful, she chirped, but the cheer was thin, brittle. Why do you sound so worried? Because he's not right, Brenda. He's talking crazy. He showed up here this morning looking. I don't know. Old but hard. Not like himself. There was a pause on her end. What do you mean talking crazy? He's talking about lawyers, Marcus said, his voice cracking on the word. and trusts and he had all these papers with him. About the hospital bills, he said. He said they weren't right. The silence on the other end of the line was different this time. It wasn't a pause. It was a void. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, calculating, assessing. Lawyers, she finally said, her voice a careful, neutral tone. What lawyers, honey, and what's wrong with the bills? I don't know, Marcus exclaimed, a believable surge of panic in his voice. He was just sitting here, asking me all these questions about the sale, about the buyer. He was talking about federal laws and things I didn't understand. Brenda, I'm scared. What's going on? Eleanor and I exchanged a glance. The bait was in the water. She was circling it, trying to decide if it was safe to bite. Okay, honey, calm down, Brenda said, her voice shifting into a smooth, reassuring purr. It was the voice she used to close a deal, the voice of a predator calming its prey. Just tell me everything. From the beginning. What did he say exactly? She took the bait. The trap was now set. All Marcus had to do was hold the line. Marcus took a shaky breath, playing his part to perfection. He kept talking about a trust. The Prairie Legacy Archive Trust. He said the seeds weren't his to sell, that they were owned by this trust. Eleanor gave Marcus a subtle thumbs up. It was the perfect opening move. A trust, Brenda's voice was sharp for a fraction of a second before smoothing over again. Oh, honey, that's just legal nonsense. Your father is old and confused. He probably doesn't even remember the documents he signed years ago. What documents? Marcus asked, his voice a perfect blend of confusion and hope. The ones giving you power of attorney, of course, she said breezily. The ones that allow you to make financial decisions on his behalf in a medical emergency. It was all perfectly legal, Marcus. I had my own lawyers look everything over. Your own lawyers, of course, she scoffed gently. I wouldn't let you sign anything without making sure we were protected. Your father is just trying to cause trouble because he never liked that we were independent. He wants to control you. Eleanor scribbled a note on a pad and pushed it in front of Marcus. Ask about Agricorp. But he mentioned a name, Marcus stammered. Agricorp. He said they've been trying to buy the seeds for years. He said they were worth millions. The silence on the line was electric. For the first time I heard a flicker of genuine uncertainty in her voice. Millions, don't be ridiculous. That's just your father's pride talking. He thinks his little hobby is the Hope Diamond. But is it true? Marcus pressed, sounding like a desperate child. Did Agricorp want to buy them? There may have been some interest in the past, she admitted, her voice cautious. But the market for that kind of thing is very volatile. We got a very good price from our buyer, Marcus. A very generous price. Who was our buyer? Brenda Marcus asked. Dad said he thinks it was Agricorp using a shell company. Your father watches too many movies, she laughed, but the sound was brittle fake. It was a private collector. I handled the entire transaction to protect your family from any legal blowback. You see, I was thinking ahead, protecting you. Eleanor scribbled another note, federal law. She's lying. Trap her. But Dad was talking about. That is about some kind of federal law, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He said it was more than just a sale. Something about biopiracy. The word landed like a stone in a quiet pond. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. She knew the word. That was the mistake we were waiting for. That's absurd, she snapped, her voice losing its smooth veneer for the first time. That's a ridiculous paranoid accusation. Who has he been talking to? Who is this lawyer? I don't know her name, Marcus said, but he's meeting with her again this afternoon. To file something. Brenda, what did we do? Are we in trouble? No, she said, but her voice was strained. We are not in trouble. Your father is bluffing. But I think I need to talk to my contact at Agricorp. Just to be safe, don't do anything. Don't sign anything. Don't talk to your father. Just wait for my call. She had just confessed. Not in a court of law, but here on this recording she had linked herself directly to Agricorp. She had admitted to knowing this was more than a simple sale. The trap had been sprung. Now it was time to close the jaws. The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, his face pale, his hand still trembling. He slowly removed the earpiece and placed it on the counter as if it were radioactive. He looked at Eleanor, then at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and a strange, dawning relief. Did we get it? He whispered. Eleanor pressed a button on the digital recorder. A small red light blinked off. She looked up, and for the first time I saw the faintest hint of a smile on her face. It was the smile of a hunter who has finally cornered her prey. Oh, we got it, she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. We got her admitting knowledge of AgriCorp. We got her admitting there was a contact. We got her panicking at the mention of federal law. We got her telling you her co-conspirator to obstruct a potential investigation. That's not just a confession, Marcus. That's a whole bouquet of felonies gift-wrapped and delivered. She stood up, placing the small recorder carefully into her briefcase as if it were a priceless jewel. I'll deliver this recording to my contacts at the U.S. Attorney's Office this afternoon. They've been building a case against AgriCorp's acquisitions department for months. This is the keystone they've been waiting for. It's over, Gideon. Thank you, Eleanor, I said quietly. It felt inadequate for what she had just accomplished. She nodded at me, a lifetime of friendship and trust passing between us in that single gesture. She then turned her gaze to Marcus. It was not a kind look. As for you, young man, she said, her voice losing its warmth, you were a fool, a willing pawn in a game you didn't even know you were playing. But you did the right thing today. It doesn't erase the mistake, but it's a start. With that, she turned and walked out of the house, leaving the two of us alone in the cavernous, silent kitchen. The silence she left behind was heavier than the one before. It was filled with unspoken questions and the wreckage of a family. I looked at my son, who couldn't meet my eyes. He stared at his hands on the countertop. Dad, he began, his voice thick with shame. I am so sorry. I know you are, Marcus, I said. Sorry is a start. It's the seed of something better. But a seed is useless if you don't plant it in good ground and work to make it grow. What do I do, he asked, his voice pleading. How do I fix this? How do I ever make this right? I stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his trembling shoulder. It was the first time I had touched him all day. You don't fix this, son. Some things once broken can't be put back together the way they were. But you can build something new. You can start by helping me reap the harvest she sowed. Because this fight isn't over, not by a long shot. The next 48 hours moved faster than any harvest I'd ever seen. Eleanor was true to her word. The recording was like a lit match dropped into a silo full of dry grain. The first we heard of it was a small article on the Omaha World, Herald's business page, AgriCorp VP, on leave amid federal probe. Walter Jennings, Brenda's contact, had been suspended. The article was vague, citing an ongoing investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office into irregular acquisition practices. It was a small tremor, but I knew the earthquake was coming. Marcus stayed with me at the farmhouse. He didn't belong there, not in his city clothes and his restless energy, but he didn't belong in his own house anymore either. He walked the fields with me silent, watching me work, as if trying to understand the language of the land he had almost given away. He barely spoke, but I could see him changing. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful humility. He was finally learning to listen. The second piece of news came via a text message from Eleanor 2 days later. It was a single sentence. Her accounts are frozen. A federal judge had issued an injunction freezing every known asset Brenda possessed, pending the outcome of the investigation. The money from the sale, the funds for her wellness retreat, her personal savings, all of it locked away in a legal deep freeze. The trap had not only sprung, its steel jaws were now clamped shut. That evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sun bleed across the vast empty sky, Marcus's phone rang. He looked at the screen and I saw his face tighten. It was her. You should answer it, I said quietly. It's time to close the book. He hesitated, then nodded, his jaw set. He answered, putting the phone on speaker as before. Marcus, thank God, her voice was a ragged, terrified shriek, all the smooth confidence gone. You have to help me. My bank accounts. They're frozen. I can't access a single dollar. The bank is talking about a federal order. What's happening? Marcus looked at me, and I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. He was no longer the pawn. He was his own man now. I know, Brenda, he said, and his voice was cold, clear, and steady. A voice I hadn't heard from him in years. I know all about it. I know about AgriCorp. I know about the lies. I know everything. There was a stunned silence followed by a choked sob. You told him. You told your father I did, Marcus said. And he in turn told his lawyer. And his lawyer Brenda told the FBI. Number, she wailed, the sound thin and desperate. You can't do this to me, Marcus. We're married. You have to help me. A marriage built on a lie isn't a marriage, Brenda, he said, his voice unwavering. It's a business transaction, and your business has just filed for bankruptcy. Before she could respond, he ended the call. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone in his hand. Then he looked up at me, the setting sun glinting in his eyes. For the first time in a very long time, I saw his grandfather looking back at me. I saw a haze. Winter came to the prairie, blanketing the fields in a clean, quiet layer of white. It was a time for rest, for the land to heal and gather its strength for the season to come. It felt fitting. Our own family was in a season of quiet healing. The legal storm, once it broke, was swift and decisive. Brenda, faced with the irrefutable evidence of the recording and the mountain of documents Eleanor had compiled, took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud and conspiracy, turning state's evidence against Walter Jennings and AgriCorp in exchange for a lighter sentence. She was still facing 3 to 5 years in a federal facility. Her life of lies had finally caught up with her. AgriCorp, terrified of a public trial that would expose their predatory practices, settled out of court. The sum was staggering. They paid back the $200,000, covered all our legal fees, and most importantly signed a legally binding agreement to never again attempt to acquire or interfere with the Prairie Legacy Archive. They also made a substantial multi-million-dollar donation to the university research program partnered with our trust. Eleanor called it punitive damages. I called it justice. Marcus filed for divorce the day after Brenda's arrest. It was a clean break. She had built their marriage on a foundation of deceit, and when the lies were stripped away, there was nothing left to salvage. He sold the big sterile house in Omaha, and to my surprise asked if he could stay with me at the farmhouse for a while. Just until I figure things out, he'd said. That was 3 months ago. He hadn't left. He'd traded his tailored suits for denim and flannel. The soft hands of a supply chain director were slowly becoming calloused. He was learning the rhythms of the land, the language of the seasons. He wasn't a natural farmer, not like my father or me, but he was a hard worker, and he was a quick study. More importantly, he was present. He was listening. One cold morning, as the sun was just beginning to cast a pale light over the snow-covered fields, I found him in the cellar. He wasn't looking at the jars of seeds. He was standing in front of my old workbench, running his hand over the worn, scarred wood where my father had taught me to repair equipment. I never understood this place, he said quietly, not turning to look at me. To me, it was just a dark, dusty basement, full of old junk. It's not junk, Marcus, I said, walking to stand beside him. It's a library. Every tool, every jar, every note in my father's old ledgers. They're all stories. You just have to learn how to read them. He looked at me, his eyes clear and direct. I want to learn, he said. I want you to teach me. A slow smile spread across my face. It was the first genuine, unguarded smile I had felt in a very long time. It wasn't the smile of victory, but of something far more precious, hope. All right, son, I said. The first lesson is the most important one. I turned and walked over to the shelves that lined the cellar walls. Each jar was meticulously labeled in my father's steady cursive names like Henderson's Pride, Prairie Gold, Winter King. They weren't just names, they were promises. Each one held a story of survival. I ran my fingers along the cool glass, feeling the history contained within. My hand stopped on a small, amber-colored jar at the very back of the shelf. The label was faded, the ink blurred by time. It read simply, Anna's Hope 1934. I took the jar down. The seeds inside were small and dark, unassuming. They didn't look like much, but they were everything. This, I said, turning back to Marcus, is where it all started. Your great-grandmother, Anna. During the worst of the Dust Bowl, when everything else had turned to dust, she found a single stalk of wheat growing in the driest part of the field, sheltered by a rock, a freak of nature. She harvested the seeds by hand. 27 of them. She called them her hope. I held the jar out to him. Everything else in this room, every success, every breakthrough, it all grew from these 27 seeds. It grew from her refusal to give up. Marcus reached out and took the jar from me. He held it in both hands, his calloused fingers cradling the glass with a reverence I had never seen in him before. He stared down at the small, dark seeds, his breath misting on the cool surface. The lesson isn't about genetics, Marcus, I said quietly. It's not about drought resistance or crop yields. The real legacy, the one that matters, is this. It's not about what you inherit. It's about what you choose to cultivate. He looked up from the jar, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I understand, Dad, he whispered. I think, for the first time, I finally understand. I placed my hand on his shoulder, the same shoulder I had held in a grip of anger just a few months ago. Now it was a gesture of peace, of acceptance. The winter was ending. Outside, the snow would soon begin to melt, revealing the rich, dark soil beneath. It was good ground. It was ready for a new season. We stood there for a long time in the quiet, dusty cellar, a father and his son holding a jar of seeds. It wasn't just a lesson. It was a handing off, a promise that the harvest would continue. That spring, for the first time in nearly a decade, Marcus and I planted a field together. It wasn't a large field, just a small test plot behind the farmhouse. We took the seeds from the jar labeled Anna's Hope and planted them by hand, just as she had done all those years ago. As we worked side by side under the vast Nebraska sky, I saw not the supply chain director from Omaha, but a man rediscovering his roots, literally and figuratively. He was learning that true wealth isn't found on a balance sheet, but in the rich, dark earth beneath your feet and the legacy you nurture for those who come after. He had lost his wife, his house, and the life he thought he wanted, but in doing so, he had found himself. He had come home. The legal battles were over, the criminals were facing their own bitter harvest, and the Prairie Legacy Archive was safe, more secure than ever. But my greatest victory wasn't in a courtroom. It was right here in the quiet company of my son, watching a new season begin. This story is a powerful reminder that the greatest legacies aren't always the ones you can see. They are not always measured in dollars or acres, but in the seeds of wisdom and resilience planted by those who came before us. My journey was about protecting more than just a collection of seeds. It was about safeguarding the very idea that hard work, integrity, and foresight are the true cornerstones of a lasting inheritance. It was a painful lesson, one born from betrayal, but it ultimately brought my family closer together, reminding us that even after the harshest winter, a new season of growth is always possible. What a journey we've shared today. Stories like mine remind us that the deepest roots are the ones that hold a family together, even through the fiercest storms. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.